Support for The Nocturnist comes from the California Medical Association.
At The Nocturnist, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
This is The Nocturnist Conversations. I'm Emily Silverman. Medicine is often seen as a world of science, logic, and efficiency. But what happens when we bring in something unexpected, like musical theater? Dr. Allan Detsky is a well-known physician in Canadian internal medicine and health economics. He's a physician, professor, and researcher with over 95 publications in JAMA and the New England Journal of Medicine. But as we learn in today's episode, he's also a lifelong lover of Broadway and even a producer of hit shows like Come From Away. During the COVID-19 pandemic, as masked faces and Zoom meetings stripped away the humanity from medical training, Allan turned to musical theater as a tool to reconnect with his team. Every day, he gathered his students and residents for a short ritual, sitting down together and watching a music video. At first, it was a lighthearted distraction, but over time, it became something more, a lesson in observation, emotion, and connection. In my conversation with Allan, we talk about how health economics shapes his perspective on healthcare, the differences between the Canadian and U.S. healthcare systems, his unexpected journey into Broadway producing, and why he believes that every physician should bring their outside passion into their teaching. Allan is a natural storyteller with a wealth of experience in both medicine and the arts, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with him as much as I did. But first, take a listen to Allan reading from his piece, The Music Video.
In March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic imposed changes. First, we put on masks that prevented us from seeing faces of other team members. Second, we limited the number of team members visiting the bedside of patients to reduce exposure of healthcare personnel to COVID-19. Third, we moved in-person large group meetings, like grand rounds, to Zoom, where most participants turned off their cameras. These changes led to the loss of an important aspect of humanity, face-to-face interaction. In response, I looked for a way to reintroduce humanity into our time together. I stumbled on something from my background in musical theater production, an activity that I soon called the music video. Every day, our team takes 4 to 6 minutes to watch a video that contains music. At first, I used the videos as a diversion to lift our spirits, with no other purpose other than entertaining the team. But over time, our reactions motivated me to pursue more specific objectives. These include setting a mood for the day, upbeat, fun, mellow, introspective, sad, improving our powers of observation, displaying my passion for this form of art to role model broadening one's horizons, and teaching them something about musical theater. As a general theme, these viewings show the power of vocal performance to bring us out of ourselves and into contact with others. We couldn't see each other's faces, something we dearly missed, but we could all see the facial expressions of the artists. I developed a list of favorites. I always start with upbeat videos, usually either Joshua Lee Turner's Band on the Bus version of Baby Driver, or the 2018 Tony presentation of Once on This Island. The former shows a group of 5 musicians on their tour bus, happily covering a Simon & Garfunkel hit song. It's impossible not to smile while viewing it. It's a toe tapper. The latter is, in my opinion, the best example of a performance of a Tony Award program because it motivates viewers to see the show. Matthew Thomas Grant's Thank Me Now from the Los Angeles production of Emojiland the Musical evokes emotions of first-year residents in the middle of a night on call, complete with the anger and intensity of circumstances when asked to simultaneously handle 10 urgent clinical tasks. I point out Grant's remarkable use of his eyes and hands to convey the song's message. Shalina Kennedy's Omar Sharif from the Tony-winning musical The Band's Visit is sublime and soothing, embracing a Middle Eastern tone. I show that one when the team needs to relax. Sometimes I show them two different versions of the same song. A great example is I Say a Little Prayer, a Burt Bacharach and Hal David classic covered by many people. My favorite covers are Kenton Chen with the Scary Pockets and the karaoke-style performance by the cast of the film My Best Friend's Wedding. This exercise shows the group how the same stem of material, music and lyrics, can evoke very different reactions with different interpretations resulting from the cultural context of the artists. See Aretha Franklin's acclaimed pop R&B cover. On some occasions, team members bring their own ideas. While working over Christmas, a resident from the United Kingdom showed us an excerpt from The Snowman, our cartoon about a little boy that people in the United Kingdom watch all over the holiday season. While watching the video, I could see both pride and homesickness on the English resident's face, reflecting the capacity of music to evoke powerful memories. On my last day with one team, I showed them a cover of Vincent, the haunting song by Don McLean about Vincent van Gogh's mental illness, sung brilliantly by Voces 8, a London-based a cappella group. The intertwined beauty and sadness left us speechless. All I could say was, that was beautiful, but we can't end on that note. So we watched a second video that day, Cynthia Erivo's uplifting performance of Stand Up, the theme song from the movie Harriet, the story of Harriet Tubman's role in the Underground Railroad. As we left the room to see our patients, I could hear the team singing behind me. I smiled. Mission accomplished. To hone their powers of observation, I asked them specific questions, sometimes before viewing, sometimes after. Christine Hudman's performance of Welcome Home from the Broadway musical Bandstand is a perfect exercise. What is this show about? A returning World War II soldier. What's the message of the song? Welcome home, I have missed you. What musical or dramatic techniques did they use to engage the audience? Key change, drum roll, riffing notes. These exercises complement the way I teach them to use inspection of patients, to really look at them as a foundational skill. But most importantly, the music video sets the mood for the day and brings the team together. When I first started doing this, I worried that residents would resent using their valuable time in a way that seemed tangential to the tasks of the day. I knew that I had to set the tone to get them to disconnect with the pressing issues on their to-do lists. Before showing the first video to a new group, I explained the purpose, asked them to put away their phones, lists, and pagers, and tell them to just relax, watch, and listen. Because I sit at the end of the table farthest from the screen, I can tell who is absorbed. They sit very still, eyes glued to the screen. And who is not. They fidget and look at something else. Some of them nod their heads or sway rhythmically. Some tap their feet or hands. At the end, they often clap. And while I have not done a formal evaluation, some of them spontaneously tell me that it was their favorite part of the day. This teaching method is not unique. Moniz et al. Published a scoping review of 769 records of the use of arts in medical education, including literature, narrative writing, theater, film, comedy, and graphic novels. The same authors proposed a theoretical framework for doing so. But I had no formal structure, no evaluation strategy. I was simply looking for something to counterbalance all of the sadness we see in our patients, a sadness that was exacerbated during COVID-19. Over time, this activity has grown into something more, a chance to integrate thought processing skills I learned in my second career in theater into my day job. Doing so requires a teacher to be brave and take risks. The students may not like what we have to offer, but maybe they will. I looked forward to the day when we could take our masks off in clinical settings and see each other again. I was pretty sure that when that was going to happen, the music video would remain an important part of my routine.
I am sitting here with Dr. Allan Detsky. Allan, thanks for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
So, Allan, you are a bit of a towering figure in Canadian internal medicine and health economics. You have your own Wikipedia page, which I discovered in preparation for this interview. And you have many different interests: clinical medicine, health economics, and as we learn in this reading, musical theater, and even venturing into producing Broadway musicals yourself. So to begin, I wanted to hear a bit about coming up in medicine, your time in Canada, your time in the US, and weaving in this interest of health economics to begin with before we get into the artistic part.
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to tell my story. As you will soon realize, I am one of my favorite subjects. I was born in Toronto in 1951 and lived in Forest Hill Village, Toronto, and went to high school, public school here. By chance alone, I somehow decided to go to MIT as an undergraduate. And on the very first day of school, even before school started, when we were finding places to live, I met my two best friends for life. One of them is my friend Larry Backow, who was one of my roommates, and the other was my friend Kenny Mewson. They both went on to have spectacular careers and had a lot of influence on me. I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. So I was an economics major, and I decided that I would just go to graduate school. I got into a whole bunch of graduate schools. I really wanted to go out to California, but I was too comfortable in Cambridge, in Boston. So I stayed at MIT, and very quickly in grad school realized I didn't want to be an economics professor. In fact, I had a negative role model, a man named Rob Engel, who was an assistant professor, wasn't going to get tenure because none of them did, got paid $14,000 a year, and lived in a rental apartment and drove a 12-year-old Volkswagen. And I thought, if this is the best job in economics, I wonder what the worst job in economics was. And so I decided to go to medical school. And my friend Larry said, if you just continue on and get a PhD in economics, I'll bet nobody has done that combination. That's how you'll get into Harvard Medical School. Larry was always filled with the best ideas, and he was absolutely right. That's how I got into Harvard Medical School. And I got into the Harvard Health Science and Technology program, which was a fantastic program of 25 students. And I went on to do a residency, finished my PhD at MIT, and graduated with both my PhD in economics. My thesis supervisor was Robert Solow, who went on to win the Nobel Prize. So I met a lot of really incredible people. And so I went on to do residency at Mass General in general internal medicine. I was in the primary care program. And one day, my pager went off, and the page operator said, "There's a Dr. Eugene Veda from the University of Toronto on the phone, and he'd like to speak to you." I was an intern. I said, "Okay." And he said, "Hi, Allan. We have a tenure track position in health economics in the Department of Health Administration, which at the time was part of the Faculty of Medicine. And we think you'd be a good candidate for this. Some people here know you from when they were at Harvard. And would you like to take this job?" Now, I'm sure that it was more complicated than that, but that's the only part of it I remember. And I remember saying to myself, let me think about it for a minute. Okay. And that's how I ended up at the University of Toronto, again, coming home.
It's pretty unique, as you said, to come to clinical medicine with this lens of economics. And I was wondering if you could tell me, what does the medical world look like through that lens? How did you have a unique perspective compared to your peers practicing medicine in the hospital?
In a number of ways. First of all, the lens of economics, at least the way I was taught it, teaches you to understand incentives and the difference between intrinsic incentives, intrinsic motivation, and extrinsic motivation, and to understand the way those two things weave together to motivate people. Economics is not about money. It's not about costs. It's about choices. Do I choose to be a general internist or a cardiologist? Do I choose to do echocardiography or be a CCU doctor? And on the consumer side, Do I choose to go to the ER or do I choose to not do anything about this? It's all about choices and incentives. One of the basic frameworks is understanding incentives and what happens when incentives get distorted. The other aspect, which was more modern, is behavioral economics, which is understanding the cognitive biases we have in framing questions and getting the answer you want by framing things either as losses or gains, the concept of getting people to fear of missing out, which gets them to take risks. I once wrote a paper called Snakes on a Dock.
Like snakes on a plane?
Like snakes on a plane. And it's the story of me looking for some snakes that fell off my dock. And I was anchored by the fact that chairs fell to the bottom. So I thought the snakes fell to the bottom until I did an experiment and realized that those snakes didn't sink. They floated, and I could find them at the side of the lake, not the bottom of the lake. Cognitive reasoning. Those two lenses, incentives and cognitive reasoning, are important. And then just understanding systems. I mean, I totally understand how we pay for healthcare in Canada and how you pay for it there to a lesser degree. I understand how hospitals are budgeted. I've been doing this in Canada since 1980. I've seen governments come and governments go. And when CEOs or people start flapping saying, this time's different, I say, no, it's not. They're going to do this that they think is disruptive. The public is going to object to it. It'll be into the media, and they will back off and go back to doing something else. The basic tenets of what we have in Canadian healthcare are not going to change the political dynamic and the economic dynamic. That's been a very useful perspective. Plus, I went on to become the chair of the economics committee for our practice plan, which is like a managing partner of a law firm. So I used that economic management to help run the department. And then I became the chief of medicine, who is in charge of that practice plan. And I did that for 12 years. So the economics part has actually led me to parts of my career that used economics. When I was chief of medicine, I quickly learned that the best training for being in charge of a group of people was being a unit head at a summer camp, because the needs of the 13-year-old boys, I ran the boys unit, my wife ran the girls unit, the needs of the 13-year-old boys and a 45-year-old man are the same. Everybody wants to be loved. They want to feel that they are appreciated. It's not how much money I'm paying you. It's how much money I'm paying you relative to what you think you deserve. That's a really important economic lesson that I kind of learned in graduate school, but I actually learned it more at camp.
You mentioned being very familiar through your health economics work with the difference between healthcare in Canada and healthcare in the United States. And that's a comparison that people talk about a lot, especially as we talk about dysfunction in American healthcare and looking to the Canadian system. What can we learn from Canada? And I was wondering if you could share anything with an American audience about the Canadian healthcare system, whether it's truths or myths or anything you want to debunk or anything you want to hold up to tell us more about the Canadian v. American systems.
Here's the best description of the Canadian healthcare system. Every person who is legally in the country, citizen, permanent resident, refugees have this status too, but their mechanism is different, gets a card from the government. It's very easy to get this card. You go to one of these government stations, they take a picture of you, they ask you for your address, they put it on the card, and that little card allows you to go anywhere in Canada, because it's portable, to access doctor services and hospital services. There's no managed care. There's no utilization review. There's no copayment. There's no deductible. You don't get a bill when you leave the hospital for the things that are covered, which is pretty much everything. You can have the most expensive acute care or the least expensive primary care. The cost to the consumer is free. And there's no friction for the most part. Doesn't cover drugs, which are covered separately in each province and mostly by employers. Doesn't cover long-term care. Doesn't cover home care, mostly. So people have separate insurance for those things. That's the upside. You're never going to end up in a hospital and have somebody give you a $400,000 bill for putting in a pacemaker. Here's the downside. Since we're being dramatic today, I will give you an analogy. I didn't make this up. Somebody told this to me. In the old Soviet Union, there was a managed economy, meaning that there were no prices. Everything was given to people according to their needs, not according to their ability to pay. So if you walked into a bakery, there would be a big sign on the top saying, "The bread is free." So the customer would walk in the bakery, see the sign, and ask the person behind the counter, "Great, the bread is free. I'll take 2 loaves." And the person behind the counter would say, "But there is no bread." And that's a caricature of what happens when you have a system where everything is free. It can't be unlimited demand. There has to be limits. And the way we do that in Canada, for the most part, is through global budgeting of hospitals. Hospitals, for the most part, get a fixed budget at the beginning of the year. They spend it in every way they want. And then at the end of the year, they are held accountable and they're not allowed to go into deficit. But of course, they do go into deficit and the governments always bail them out because closing a hospital is not something that you can easily do in Canada. So there's fixed budgets for hospitals, but doctors, for the most part, are paid fee for service. And it's that tension between doctors working on the treadmill, getting paid fee for service, and hospitals working with a fixed budget that contains costs to any extent. That's the best description of how healthcare in Canada works.
And in this analogy, the bread is free, and then you ask, and then there is no bread. How would that compare to the healthcare system? Might somebody show up and say, "I need an MRI," and then be told there is no MRI, or there is no MRI in 6 months or in 9 months? Because we hear a lot about delays in Canada. And so how does that play out?
So first, let me say there are safety valves with private care in some ways. So one of my friends last night told me that he needs a hip replacement. He was told here in Toronto he'd have to wait for a year. The assistant said, but if you see him in his private clinic, they will do it right away. So he calls up the private clinic, and the private clinic is in Etobicoke, but there's also one in Calgary. And they said to him, "We can do it next Tuesday in Calgary." And he said, "But I live in Toronto." He says, "We can't do it in Toronto because the Canada Health Act doesn't allow us to charge you for it in your own province. We can charge you for it in Alberta." And it was going to be something like $30,000. So there are places where you can go to a second tier, but that is mostly frowned upon in Canada. It's very rampant in Quebec, where they've really fallen behind in terms of funding. But the vast majority of Canadians, when they hear that choice, will say, "Thank you very much, I'll wait." And they do. And they wait for stuff that is consequential, that gives them a lot of morbidity, like hip pain or knee replacement, but they put up with it. They can go away to the United States. Despite what you might hear in the media, it doesn't happen very often. Most Canadians, when they hear pay for healthcare, they go, "The bread is free. Why would I ever do that?" Now, let me just say one other thing. If you have something seriously wrong with you, like my friend's granddaughter had infective endocarditis at the age of 3 from patent foramen VSD, that damaged her pulmonary valve. She was really, really sick. She went to the hospital for sick children in Toronto. There's only one children's hospital in Toronto, only one. I said, "How was the care?" He said, "It was outstanding." He was shocked how good it was. So if you have something really wrong with you and you live in a city where that service exists, you're good. The other advantage of this is because there's only one cardiac surgery unit in Toronto, they're very good at it. Their volumes are all very high. So you get the advantages of centralization of some services.
Looking into the United States from Canada, what do you think about us and what we should do?
Noah Ivers and Edelstein Brown and I wrote a piece that was published in JAMA Internal Medicine around 2018 that said, what can Americans learn from the single payer system? And I think the conclusion of that is probably what I would say fits the best. A single payer system that only covers hospital and physician services solves a lot of problems, but it doesn't solve every problem. And it certainly doesn't mean you get an integrated system with smooth transitions and coordination and continuity. It doesn't do anything for that. That is way better served in a private system where customer satisfaction is the key. And there are many innovative models in the United States of long-term care, rehab care that are way better. We don't have those in Canada because we don't pay for them. One of my friends who's an ENT surgeon said to me, there's nothing more dangerous than a surgeon with open OR time. If you have a back problem and you see a spine surgeon in the United States and they have open OR time, they will recommend surgery. If you see the same kind of doctor in Canada where the OR time is cherished, they will tell you not to have surgery. And in most cases, the Canadian doctor will be right. That's maybe too broad a statement, but you don't get unnecessary care from people who have facilities that have excess capacity.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I have a friend who recently took a job in surgery at a big hospital center and got hired and got brought on. And I said, how's the job going? And he said, it's okay. And I said, well, what's not working? And he said, well, there's a lot of competition between the other surgeons and I'm just having trouble finding work. I'm having trouble finding patients. And it was interesting because I had never really thought about surgery from the supply side, from the perspective of the surgeon looking for patients. I had always imagined it on the other side, the patient looking to find a surgeon. And it does feel a little odd to view it through that reverse lens, doesn't it?
Yes.
Before we move on to talk about musical theater, I just wanted to mention one last piece of yours that you wrote. It was a perspective, and it's called Night Call in a Teaching Hospital, 1979 and 2019. You paint a picture of a night shift in 1979, and then you paint a picture of a night shift in 2019. And this helps the audience see how healthcare has evolved and changed and shifted over the last few decades. So I was wondering if you could talk about that piece and just reflect a bit on now coming up toward the later stages of your career, what you see in how things have changed.
One of my favorite things is to co-write intergenerationally. I once wrote a piece. Victor Fuchs was 87. I was 57. And Stephen Gauthier was 27. And we wrote a piece on specialization that got published in JAMA. I just love putting together people of different generations to write. And so that story of Night Call in the Teaching Hospital, some of it's the same and some of it's different. There was a coffee room at Mass General where I was an intern. It was very small, but it was the hub of the hospital. It was basically the Twitter of the hospital. You went to get a social interaction. You could have a cup of coffee. And I went back years later after I finished my residency and just sat in that room. What was interesting was nobody even noticed that I was there. And I was listening to the conversation and I said, you know what? These are the same words, the same topics, the same things we talked about 10 years ago. And I think that's still true now. If you listen to the residents and the students at night talking about stuff, they talk about the same thing. Personalities of the attending, how much work they have to do, what the nurses are asking them to do, not getting a consult. So those issues are the same. The biggest difference is that in 1979, we only had 20 medicines. We couldn't do anything. And one of them was lidocaine, which we gave to people with suspected acute myocardial infarctions, not realizing that it was killing them. Don Burke and I once wrote a piece on teaching physicians to care amid chaos. And we pointed out that in the 1970s, all we really had was good intentions. And that's a huge difference between what we have now. We have a lot more tools. It's a lot faster paced. It's way more stressful now. The things we could do at our own pace when I was a house staff member, life just doesn't look like that anymore. There are many more people taking care of patients. There's a lot more communication. The other big difference, which I've pointed out in a paper called On the General Inspection, Resurrecting The Art of Inspection. We used to take the histories from the patients. Now, you would never even think of taking a history from the patient. You look at the chart electronically because there's tons of data available to you. You go through that first, and then you go to see the patient and you ask them questions about the parts you really want to know. That's efficient. It sometimes leads to mistakes because the story that's in the electronic record is repeating an error. Like one of the residents a couple of weeks ago presented a case to me of a man. He said, this man had a radical prostatectomy in 1988. And I was like, there were no radical prostatectomies in 1988. He had a TERP. And he said, what's a TERP? I said, and where'd you get that from? Oh, it was in the old record. And that had been repeated for like a decade that he had prostate cancer when in fact he had BPH. But the other problem with doing it that way is people have lost the power of looking. The Sherlock Holmes approach to medicine that Bill Tierney and Faith Fitzgerald taught us, that when you're actually looking at somebody, you start to notice stuff that you wouldn't otherwise see. And when we get to the music video, part of what I was doing in that exercise was getting them to look at what's going on. And I would ask them questions like, how do we know that the young girl in Once on This Island and the older girl are the same character at two different points in time? And then they said, they're both wearing the same red dress. Bingo. A lot of our residents no longer look at the patients. On top of that, they don't even know how to do physical exam anymore. That's a function of COVID interrupting the general flow of teaching from senior residents to junior residents to students. We talk about the same things. We gather data, we make inferences, we have actions, we talk to other people. It's not that different. We could just do more for people. But we've lost some tools that I think are very important.
All right, let's talk about musical theater.
Great, my favorite subject.
So clearly this is a form that you've loved for your whole life. So before we get into bringing musical theater onto the medical wards, tell us about growing up and how you came to love musical theater.
Well, I owe this all to my mother, so I might get emotional here. I actually thought about this in the car the other day. I was saying, how am I going to talk about this? We lived in a house on Briar Hill Avenue, about 5 blocks north of here. And we had a small den in the back. And the den had a record player. And my father, who was in the bowling business, before that was in the record distribution business for jukeboxes. And so we had thousands of records in our basement, some of which were the cast recordings of Broadway musicals. And my mother listened to those all the time. I was a little boy and I would sit on this nubbly red chair, not in the seat, but on the top of it because I had to be able to reach the record player. And I played all of the Broadway cast recordings, Oklahoma, South Pacific, Camelot, My Fair Lady, Carousel. Those would have been my favorites. And I played those records over and over again. Those were formative for me. Not only did I listen to them, but I could sing them all. And my mother took us to plays. The very first live theater production I saw was the original production of Camelot at the O'Keefe Centre in Toronto around 1960. I went to summer camp. And in summer camp, I always was in the shows. I always wrote the shows for Color War. When I was in medical school, I was in the show. I sang a song the song was called Tits and Ass from Chorus Line. The version I called was Kiss His Ass. It was all about sucking up to your attending. Then when I was in residency, my best friend in residency, Stephen Stricker, he and I wrote the show at the end of internship year. We wrote the show at Christmas, the musical. We produced it. We starred in it. He played the instruments. We were everything. And then, of course, I moved back to Toronto, had kids, and there were no shows anymore that I was in. But we did go to theater in Toronto. We had some wonderful productions of Les Mis, Mamma Mia, The Phantom. Toronto had a vibrant commercial theater, and it had nonprofit theater, which wasn't good enough for me. I was a snob. Like, I'm only going to first-class productions. But then the first SARS happened, and that business went away because people didn't want to come to Toronto anymore because 200 people got SARS in Toronto in 2003, but it kind of killed their momentum. And we started to go to the Stratford Shakespeare Festival, which did musicals, and the Shaw Festival. And I always said the best part of that was the ride home because those productions just were not good enough for me. Until 2010, when Stratford put on a production of West Side Story, starring two people who are still two of my best friends at the musical theater. Paul Nolan, also in Broadway, he's known as Paul Alexander Nolan, who played Tony, and Maria was played by Shalina Kennedy. She was Carole King on Broadway for about 4 years. Paul's had 9 roles on Broadway since his first one, which was Jesus Christ Superstar. He played Jesus. That was an amazing production. It was better than the one on Broadway that year. We saw that too. And the next year, they put on Evita. And a young American named Josh Young from near Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, came out and started to sing Oh, What a Circus, which is the opening number of Evita. And my wife and I looked at each other and said, whoa, that is an amazing voice. He was selling his CD in the lobby after. I bought one. I gave him my card. We started talking. And the next thing I know, he said to me, how'd you like to produce my next album? Now, I had no idea what that meant other than I was paying for it. But I immediately said, just like I got my job at U of T, sure, that sounds like fun. And I learned all of the steps of producing an album, picking the songs, hiring the orchestrator, setting down the rhythm tracks, setting down the strings, setting down the wind instruments, putting the scratch vocals on, then doing the vocals, editing, which is a huge job, mastering and putting it out there and selling it. I learned all of the steps, which are really not any different than doing a research project. And then the next year, Josh was cast as Judas in Jesus Christ Superstar. It was a brilliant production. Andrew Lloyd Webber came to Stratford and they transferred it to Broadway and they needed investors. So somehow or other, I got connected with Judith Richardson, who is still my good friend. And she was the artistic producer at Stratford. And we put together a group. And the next thing you know, I was a producer on Broadway for Jesus Christ Superstar. Opening night, the Tonys. I was very involved with the actors because they were my friends. Josh got sick. Then he had to get out of the show. We had to manage that. Could he still get nominated for a Tony? We were nominated for a Tony because the show was nominated as Best Revival. The producers get nominated. The whole thing was fun. We went to the Tonys. We didn't win. He didn't win. The show closed in 4 months. We lost our entire investment. But I said at the end of it, I still had fun. One of my friends in Toronto who was involved in theater, when I told him that, he said, that's what people say the first time. After that, it's not so much fun to lose the investment. But then once you do one show, you're like a person with bleeding leg in the water. The sharks know who you are because of that title. And lots of people sent me proposals. So I met some terrific producers, Stacey Mindich, who went on to produce Dear Evan Hansen. She's a wonderful person. I did Annie with her, revival of Annie, and Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which did make a lot of money. I worked with a young man named John Mara Jr., who is just a terrific guy. He's the only person I ever got a job for on Broadway. Producers who raise money don't get jobs for people on Broadway, but he wanted to be the child wrangler for Matilda the musical. He really wanted that job, and I was in on that show. So I convinced the lead producer, who was also the lead producer of Jesus Christ Superstar. I said, listen, can you do me a favor? Hire this guy to be your wrangler. And he said, okay. That gave him a whole start in doing development of child actors and agency. I love putting people together, as you know. And so it was fun. And then we finally had a hit, a real hit. We did a show called Come From Away. Josh Young introduced me to the lead producers who were out in Seattle, Kenny and Marlene El-Hadaf. They invited me out to hear a reading of the show, which is one of the big steps in pushing it forward. And then they do the show in front of 20 people, maybe 3 times after rehearsing for 2 weeks. And I said, this show appeals to me And my wife and I became producers of that. And it had a slow path to Broadway because it was a show about 9/11. It was almost like saying, you people are too stupid to know that a musical with comedy about 9/11 isn't going to work. Like, who would write a musical comedy about 9/11?
For the audience, can I take a stab at a summary of the show?
Sure.
So Come From Away is a Broadway show that takes place in a small town in Canada. And on 9/11, all the planes in the air were diverted. And many of the planes were diverted, incidentally, to this tiny little town in a pretty rural area of Canada.
It's Gander, Newfoundland, which is quite
Gander,
remote.
Newfoundland, very remote. And so this tiny little town suddenly was exploding with people from all over the world, people who had come off the planes, and the people of Gander had to take them into their homes and integrate them into the community for, I think, a couple of weeks or a couple of days, maybe it was.
5 days.
5 days. So suddenly Gander became this big international town filled with people. And then 5 days later, quickly, they all disappeared. And it was like it was all a dream. Did I get that right?
You got it. Gander is an international airport that existed before World War II as the place where planes stopped on their way to Europe. So it had a large number of runways and could handle jets. And that's why they chose that as a place to land. They also chose it because in case there were any terrorists on those planes, there would be fewer people to kill in the town. That was also in the show. There were 9,000 residents in Gander and the surrounding communities, and they had to take care of 7,500 people for 5 days. Everything from housing, food. It is a very heartwarming story. Tom Brokaw actually told the story at the 2000 Olympics that were in Vancouver. And Michael Rubinoff, a theater guy in Toronto, picked that up and said, that would make a good musical. And he couldn't get anybody to write it except for David and Irene Sankoff, whose previous only other credit was a show called My Jewish Lesbian Mother's Wiccan Wedding. That's the only show they had ever written before that. And they were very naive. And they said, okay, we'll try it. And that turned into, we had 5 productions around the world. We won the Olivier. I still have the statue in London, and that show did well. It's still playing in Toronto, a production here, and it has an on-equity tour that's going on in the United States, and it's playing in England as well.
And I had the opportunity to see it in New York, and it really was amazing. And one thing that struck me about the musical was that you could feel the documentary element of it. You could tell that they were pulling real quotes from real people who lived in Gander, that these were real scenarios, all the little details, all the little micro situations. Like, it was just so specific that you could tell nobody had written that was real life. And so I had never seen a musical before that felt so much like a documentary version of a musical.
The way they did that was that there was a 10th anniversary in 2011 in the town of Gander, and the Come From Aways, which is a Newfoundland expression for somebody who's not from Newfoundland, they came. And David and Irene got a grant from the Canadian government to go out there. They were going to stay 3 or 4 days. They stayed a month and interviewed all the Come From Aways and all the town. And those people came to the show a lot. The pilot, the SPCA woman who was cared for the animals, the mayor, they became part of the show. The real characters would show up. And you're right, many of the words in the songs are the actual words from those interviews.
So tell us about bringing your love for musical theater into the wards. You open this episode with a reading describing how during COVID you started this ritual of playing Broadway music videos for your medical residents. I imagine some of them were probably perplexed by that and maybe initially a little annoyed by that because, of course, they have a very long to-do list. There's a lot of things to get accomplished in the day, and they may feel like, I don't actually have the time to sit down and watch this musical theater video right now. But it sounds like in the end, people really appreciated it and found value in it. And so I'm wondering how you're thinking back on that ritual.
The idea isn't totally original. There are many medical schools that do things like take students to art galleries and have them sit in front of paintings and stare at it for 10 minutes and tell me everything that you notice and how it evolves over time. That concept of taking a break, letting go, mindfulness, and just looking at something else. Right now, I'm experimenting for my back pain with something called pain reprocessing therapy. which is basically meditation. Like you do some deep breathing to get your vagal tone going. You then focus on something in your body that hurts you. And then you immediately switch it to something on your body that feels pleasant. And then you go back to the thing that hurts you and it doesn't hurt you anymore. I think that's the theory of it. And I didn't know this at the time, but that's exactly what I was doing with them. Sometimes I did it in the afternoon and sometimes I did it in the morning. They were tense and they were like, we've got a to-do list. And I had to convince them that to-do list is never going to be finished. You're never going to look at it and have nothing on it. So this was a kind of forced exercise in mindfulness. I didn't call it that then. I didn't even think of it that way. Let's just do something to put some humanity in this day. And what are we going to do? We're going to do the thing that I like. And let's see if you can learn to like it. I had one experience that was just quite remarkable. I had what was called a junior attending, meaning a very senior resident was the attending, and I rounded with him, and I didn't round with the residents. And the key was he had to appear to be the resident, so I couldn't ever be with them together. Except I would do some teaching sessions, carved out, I'm coming up to the ward, this is my time with you, so that I have some contact with the group. And we did one of these exercises. We took my favorite rock song of all time, Hotel California. I went in the room cold. I didn't know these people. I had met them, but we didn't have an ongoing relationship like I did with my usual team. I walked in, we played the song, I showed them the lyrics. I love that song. I just love it. I just love it. I just love it. So I put it up there and I said to them, what is this song about? And let me give you a clue. It ain't a hotel. And there are many theories about what it meant. Is it American hedonism? Is it really a prison because you can never check out? Is it a mental institution because they're asking for wine? It's almost like the Talmud interpreting what the Eagles thought. And the room was completely silent. No one would offer an explanation. When you're teaching and that happens, you have to be really brave to not talk. And I didn't talk. And I just waited. And finally, one of them just read each line and literally translated it. She didn't get the gist of what the song was about, but she at least attempted. Like she was willing to be brave enough to attempt this. Because I suspect that none of them had ever done anything like that since they took English in undergrad, if they even did that. And most Canadian pre-med students don't take English because you get a bad grade on it and it ruins your GPA. So it was a bomb, a complete failure. I walked out of the room and I said, I think that didn't work because they didn't know me. I was going in cold. And I picked a hard exercise. They weren't passive. They were being asked to be doing something really active. And then the next day, Rachel, who was the junior attending, comes to see me and he says, my wife and I listened to the song last night on the video at home, and we had a long debate about what the song was about. I was like, oh, well, at least you were into it. And then he said, and the senior resident told me that the residents and students that had to miss the day because they were post-call or they had clinic, there were two of them that missed it. They heard about it and they asked her to ask me to do it again. I said, are you kidding me? They heard them talk about it and they wanted me to do it again? It was a bomb. I had thought it didn't work at all. But given enough time for them to think later in the day, it came up in their brains when they got off work. And the next morning, that was all they could talk about when they got together. What did that song mean? And so you have to be brave to do this. Not everyone's going to be able to pull this off. But I contend that everybody has something outside of medicine that they do, that they can bring to the table to do a mindfulness experiment, to reset the tone. It's kind of like, have you ever jumped into a cold plunge?
I hate cold water.
I hate cold water too, but when my back is hurting, we have a cottage in Northern Ontario, and in May and June, the water is ice cold. And when I go golfing and my body is aching, I jump in the lake and I'm instantly better. It's a reset. It's like rebooting your computer. And I encourage people to do that, but recognize that in this era of let's just get the work done and get out, you have to really be brave to even try to pull that off.
Well, I think that's a great call to adventure and a great way to end this conversation. I have so much enjoyed speaking with you today. I have been speaking with Dr. Allan Detsky, physician, health economist, Broadway producer, and lover of musical theater. Thank you so much, Allan, for coming on the show.
Thanks, Emily, and I'll be speaking to you again soon.
This episode of The Nocturnist was produced by me and John Oliver. John also edited and mixed. Our executive producer is Allie Block. Our head of story development is Molly Rose Williams, and Ashley Pettit is our program manager. Original theme music was composed by Yosef Monroe, and additional music comes from Blue Dot Sessions. The Nocturnist is made possible by the California Medical Association, a physician-led organization that works tirelessly to make sure that the doctor-patient relationship remains at the center of medicine. To learn more about the CMA, visit cmadocs.org. The Nocturnist is also made possible by donations from listeners like you. Thank you so much for supporting our work in storytelling. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, subscribe, and help others find us by giving us a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. To contribute your voice to an upcoming project or to make a donation, visit our website at thenocturnists.org. I'm your host, Emily Silverman. See you next week.